this stage, I would like to introduce to you Gráinne Kilcullen. Now, Gráinne Kilcullen is a member of Action Aid Ireland, and she is the head of programs at Action Aid Ireland, and has previously worked as a programs advisor for on governance and human rights with Christian Aid, and she's also worked in Tanzania, Myanmar, Nepal, supporting civic engagement, local peace building and initiatives, and the protection of human rights defenders who are at risk. Gráinne, representing Action Aid Ireland on the Irish Coalition for Business and Human Rights, which Mary referenced at the beginning, and the AEFJM Ireland are a member of this Irish coalition. Now, Action Aid is a global federation working on women's rights for a world free of poverty and injustice. So Gráinne, I'm going to hand over to you if that's okay. So thank you very much indeed for making the time. And Gráinne, you can share your presentation whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you also, Veronica and Winifred, for sharing. I kind of really prompts me to kind of say how much we also need, you know, protection for activists and women human rights defenders, because often I think, you know, the risks that you face and those who are trying to speak out against these abuses are just so stark, and you're at so much risk that either you're taking on those risks, or you know, you're silenced because of those risks, or you're not allowed into rooms to be able to voice your concerns and to highlight the abuses. So I suppose I just wanted to say that on the offset, because I won't be talking about that too much, but I want to say how important, that your work is, and how important it is for your own protection as well in this, to be able to keep going. I think maybe I might ask Michelle if she could share the screen, just because I think mine mightn't share properly. So would that be okay, Michelle?
It's not a problem. I will in a moment.
Thanks, Michelle. And we've actually had a question in just a moment ago. People are wondering where everybody is from. So if you get a chance, because we have quite a few people from abroad, if you get a chance, maybe you'll put into the chat the country that you're from. Back to you, Gráinne. Thanks indeed, and thanks, Michelle.
Great, thanks, and thanks, Michelle. So, Michelle, I'll just take you on to the second slide there. And I wanted, I suppose, to bring people to maybe another side of the world. This was a photograph of the building of the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh that collapsed, went on fire in 2013, and that's been 10 years ago now. I don't know if you remember, but it was a building that housed about 5 factories, textile factories, and it killed about, I think the final numbers were about 1,138 people, and mainly those people were women, because the majority of garment workers are women. But there was about 2,500 people injured as well, you know. And even though this disaster and this this situation got a lot of international attention, it wasn't the only one, you know. And in Bangladesh particularly, you know, even 5 months before that, there was another a fire where, you know, about 112 people were killed, and again another textile factory. And I wanted to highlight this mainly because it shows that, you know, even 10 years on, and some of those who were injured in this have not been able to get any other employment, either because of their injuries or the psychological impact. But it's been very difficult, the recovery from the Rana Plaza disaster. But I think it also highlights the fact that, you know, very, very little has changed in the power balance between workers and corporations. Like, even though I suppose there were some kind of initiatives after the Rana Plaza disaster where, you know, there was kind of initiatives around compensation for workers or around safety building standards, it still has not shifted kind of the main focus of companies where profits take priority. Profits are often, and they're always almost, in the global north. The very high paying jobs are in the global north, and the bargaining power for prices are in the global north. So that is still, you know, the same 10 years on, despite whatever kind of small initiatives have been made in Bangladesh. The system is still very much unjust and with very entrenched power imbalances. And just to the next slide then, I suppose I wanted to kind of highlight this kind of entrenched power imbalance by kind of bringing us again to the textile industry in Bangladesh and Cambodia as well during the pandemic. And there were a lot of kind of, I suppose, some news articles around the fact that, you know, big brands had cancelled or delayed orders, or they had refused to pay for orders that had already been produced, and purely because of lockdown, of closure of shops in the global north, that those brands were just able to do that and save their own profits and not think about what it means for the workers. And again, I suppose, just to say, like, that was those delays and cancellations of orders, they affected, you know, 99% of women, because they are the garment workers majoritively. And, you know, it's the very fact that they did not have kind of fair pay or decent working conditions makes them very vulnerable to these sort of decisions that are made by corporations in the north. And just alone in Bangladesh during the pandemic in March 2020, a million garment workers were laid off. And I wanted to kind of give an example of a woman in Cambodia, just to kind of make it a bit more real. And this photograph actually was of a number of women in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, protesting against these layoffs. But what happened to one of the garment workers, her name was Chana, she had been working at the factory for about 13 years in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. It was a subcontractor to Nike, actually, even though Nike denied any sort of relationship with the factory, despite a lot of evidence to show that the factory was subcontracted and producing clothes for Nike. But Chana, she had actually become pregnant. She was on maternity leave, and she was checking in with the factory to see how everything was, especially with the kind of news of the pandemic. But you know, quickly, when she was supposed to return to work, she lost her job. The factory was closed down, causing again a lot of layoffs of women in that factory. And even under, you know, the Cambodian labor law, they were entitled to about $3,000 of compensation, but they were only ever kind of offered about $700. And this is an example of, you know, where, you know, the garment workers themselves were protesting and really challenging on the lack of compensation. But also it meant that a lot of garment workers found it very difficult to find other jobs. And Chana herself, you know, couldn't find another job. You know, her husband then got sick. She had to borrow money in order to pay for his medical treatment. was unable to kind of survive with the family in Phnom Penh, so had to send her newborn child to her grandparents. And I suppose and she eventually had to take that $700, you know, even though it was much less than what she was entitled to, but because she had all of these bills, she had to do it. And the reason I'm kind of highlighting her story is because it really does show how you know, how, like, the consequences that happen when there is no accountability, where there is no respect for labor laws, and where big brands wash their hands of it and say, well, there is absolutely no legislation to hold me accountable, first of all. But the fact that I think, and Winifred and Veronica said this so clearly, that they just don't care. It's not about them. It's not about their lives. It's not about whether they have a decent job or decent wage. It's about profits. So just the next slide. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that in the textile industry, but, you know, like, these abuses are not limited, obviously, to the textile industry, which we've just heard about, and it really goes across, you know, so many different industries, like agriculture, agribusiness, mining. And, you know, I think we've talked about it already, like the pollution and the effects that has on women, whether it is causing the destruction of their land, where then in a way they're forced into kind of, you know, not having enough food security, or there's pollution of water, which means obviously not limited access then to clean water, or women have to travel further, because often women are the ones who are collecting water for their families, and they have to travel further, which makes them at further risk of harassment, abuse, sexual violence. So these impacts are really, they have a lot of tentacles, if I could say that, but also land grabbing. And I think, you know, when we talk about land grabbing, you know, this because the majority of small farm holders are managed by women, even though only about 15% of women actually own their own land. And that makes it very difficult for women then to be involved in decision making and consultation, or to be able to legally protect their land, and therefore are a lot more vulnerable. And I also, you know, the kind of pervasive kind of violations of sexual and gender-based violence as well is so pervasive. It's across all of the industries, especially against women, and this is just a constant barrier to you know, women speaking out, to women claiming their rights. But also, I think, just to add as well, another kind of trend is that barrier to justice. And, you know, often we find that if if women do want to speak out, or they do want to challenge the abuse, they often are, you know, dismissed at police stations, because the police won't take them seriously because of, you know, patriarchal norms. They don't often have access to legal aid, which they need in order to be able to pursue their cases. And again, you know, because costs of going through court are just so high that it makes it really hard. And I wanted to highlight this because I think, you know, those impacts, you know, they're because they are not gender neutral, and it's because there is so many gender norms and that really prevent, I suppose, women from being able to realize their rights, but also that are kind of allowing these abuses to continue, and for women to be very adversely affected by it. And I suppose I also wanted to highlight as well that one of those gender norms, and I think we see this across so many societies, is that dual role that women often play. So, you know, they might be, you know, cultivating their land, which does provide food for the family and maybe are able to sell some at the market, but they're also, you know, responsible for caring for children and for the sick and the elderly. And I suppose when you look at things like land, like pollution, or even land grabbing, or kind of any sort of violence that happens with land grabbing, women are often the ones who have to care for those who get injured or those who are sick as a result of that pollution. So it is additional harms, even though they're not visible, but they are really exacerbated by those norms. Yeah, so I just wanted to go to the next slide, and I suppose I just wanted to highlight again just one other example, and this is kind of just to show how the convergence of abuses, you know, come together really, and you know, even if, you know, sometimes you know, it's all in the one place where there is pollution, there is land grabbing, and there is barriers to justice. So this was a photograph of a focus group discussion of women in the Kiryandongo district in Uganda, and they were raising their concerns basically after about 35,000 people, 35,000, like it's just so huge, between 2017 and 2020 were forcibly removed from their houses, from their land, to make way for sugar plantation or sugarcane plantation. And these were by transnational agribusiness companies. And the kind of forced removal obviously was not peaceful. It was extremely violent. There were machete gangs, there were private security companies, there was local police that were involved, and some got arrested for resisting this land grab, but a lot of crops were destroyed in the process, community schools, even the health center. And it just shows you how violent and destructive these can be, just to be able to plant sugarcane. And you know, the people who were forcibly removed had been there for about 10 years, which is not, I suppose, a very, very long time. It's long enough, but the reason they was because they had also fled violence in other parts of Uganda in the 1990s. So it just shows you how they're compact, the kind of how violence is just continues and is layered, and the trauma is severe. So I suppose basically what has happened with the situation in Uganda is that communities have started a number of legal cases, and this again shows the difficulty to getting access to justice, but they have started those legal cases in April 2020, and they're really looking for, you know, independent investigation into the harms and damages that were done, a mechanism for compensation, and to get their land back, or at least be permanently resettled in another place. But they haven't. Those cases are still ongoing. They haven't been able to find any progress there, and I think again, the fact that there was a lot of women who were engaged in this resistance and the legal cases, they were the ones who were facing that dismissal from police, or not able to access legal aid because of their, you know, unable to have kind of financial independence from their families, and not able to pursue that, so making it very difficult for them. just the next slide. And Brian, how much time do I have left?
Hi, Gráinne, you've about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
I was sneakily sending you little text there, but you
Okay.
were
Yeah,
very
I
busy
did
there.
it.
Go ahead, keep
Yeah,
going. You're
no,
fine. That's
yeah,
absolutely fine.
it's,
Don't worry, just keep going.
yeah, no problem, no problem. I suppose, I feel like maybe I'm repeating what has already been said, but I wanted to highlight the fact that these examples are not because these are bad companies, or that it happened that it was just that the communities were at the wrong place at the wrong time. Like it is very much a part of an unjust system and unjust structures where impunity is rife, and we see that because there is no legislation to hold companies to account, these things can happen without any consequences. And that's, obviously the abuses that we've talked against women, but also the abuse against the environment and how harmful these activities are to people and the planet, and how they're able to get away with things, and this abuse. And I suppose the fact that these systems and structures are so ambiguous that it allows for such high levels of impunity. And we see that it's very hard often to get information, and it's very difficult to understand which companies own which subsidiaries. We don't know where they're resident often, and there's often, again, the fact that there's a lot of financial flows coming out of countries where companies are making their own profits, but because of the tax system, they're able to take those profits and not, and countries where those industries are operating are not able to benefit from any of the profits at all. So it is very systematic and very structural what is enabling companies to do this, and what's enabling them to do it with impunity. And I think that's, just going on to the last slide, that is why we need legislation. And I know John will talk about this more comprehensively, but we have seen that like international law applies to states, and the international law, I suppose, expects states then to have their own domestic legislation that can protect human rights. But we know that their legislation does not necessarily hold companies to account. And there has been soft law, which has been very strong, but it's still voluntary around the UN guiding principles, guidelines from the OECD that are really trying to show how companies should be respecting human rights, and should be accountable for any abuses that they're causing, but it's not working. And there's been so much, there's been a lot of momentum in the corporate sector around ESG, or environmental, social, corporate governance, but there has been huge criticism around that as well. And the fact that it's very voluntary, it's a self-assessment, it's able to it's not necessarily measuring a lot of complex consequences that corporations are contributing to. Like, for example, they might be able to monitor their carbon emissions, but they're not necessarily monitoring the impact on biodiversity of their activities, and how insects are being destroyed and not able to pollinate in a lot of areas now. So it's very, very weak. So that's what the Irish Coalition for Business and Human Rights has been really pushing for now, is for legislation. There is a lot of support for the UN binding treaty, and I know Veronica mentioned it earlier, but that has been in process for almost 10 years now, next year, with, little, I suppose, slow progress. But I think there is definitely movement on the EU side of things, and very welcome domestic legislation in France and Germany and Norway to try and fill this gap. But I think that we do need legislation, and we need it to be gender sensitive. And I think that's the last slide, is really to make sure that legislation is not just made again by white males in the decision-making process, but are also bringing, very much bringing in the perspectives of women, but that it is gender responsive and gender sensitive due diligence. So yeah, that's I'll end it there, Michelle, and thanks very much for sharing. But yeah, that's.
Thank you very much indeed. You have really built upon the presentations of Veronica and Winifred a little bit earlier. You've given us a global picture, but you've also brought us to the place where we're now discussing legislation. We're now looking at what it is governments can do, what it is that might be the responsibility of transnational corporations or big business. You kind of mentioned kind of almost a greenwashing, a sports washing, or companies making themselves look one way but doing other things with impunity. But you've kind of brought us to this place where we're going to see exactly what it is we can do ourselves as part of AEFJN. And you mentioned the Irish Coalition for Business and Human Rights, the ICBHR, and how as AEFJN Ireland, we are a member of that, and how there are a number of members here on the call and on the Zoom this evening, for which we're very grateful. But I'm going to invite, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on, Gráinne, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And there is a question that's actually come up, but I think it might more apply, and you can come in again a little bit later on, it might more apply after the piece that John might do himself, if